I think there are some very interesting mechanism on social media today in China. It's more participatory. So previously, it's like the top-down enforcement, like blocking some website. Today, there are some people who voluntarily write for the proto-nationalist stories.
Sure.
And the liberals are always lagging behind. And some fact-based stories always lag for 2 or 3 days, often in response to this opportunity structure created by the proto-nationalist media. So once they have attracted a lot of attention, then the other side would respond. So there is a lag. But previously, like 10 years ago, it was a different story. So the liberal would create a story first. And then the nationalist would
respond.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's very interesting. I'm sorry for asking you questions.
I watched your Frontline interview, and you talk about your experience being poisoned twice in 2015 and 2017. After you have recovered from this poisoning, in retrospect, have you realized how it was possibly done?
I don't know the exact way or the exact place or time, but so I'm not sure of the precise who and the where and the when, but I have absolutely no doubt about why. I have no doubt that these two assassination attempts by poisoning in 2015 and 2017 were reprisals for my political activity in the Russian democratic opposition. More specifically, I think reprisals for my work over many years now in the international Magnitsky campaign, which is the campaign for the introduction of personal, targeted individual sanctions by Western countries against corrupt officials and human rights abusers in Vladimir Putin's regime. And so, unfortunately, I wish I could say that what happened to me is surprising, but it isn't, because we have known for a long time that it's a dangerous vocation to be in opposition to Vladimir Putin's regime, and we know that many of our friends, opposition activists, opposition leaders, anti-corruption campaigners, independent journalists, have been attacked, harassed, imprisoned, forced into exile, or killed. And a little more than 3 years ago, the leader of the Russian opposition, Boris Nemsov, former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, was gunned down as he crossed a bridge 200 meters from the Kremlin wall in what was the most high-profile political assassination in modern Russia. So we know that it's risky and dangerous to actively engage in opposition to Mr. Putin. So what happened to me is just one more illustration, or I can say two more illustrations, of what it entails to be advocating for a free and democratic Russia, and to actually be actively involved in efforts in this movement.
It's interesting that they killed Boris Nemsov just outside Kremlin, and not in some corners of the street or in the forest. This one is like a blatant message to the opposition.
Nothing
leaders.
can be more blatant than to kill the leader of the opposition in the most well-guarded area of probably the whole of Europe. I mean, I don't know if have you been to Moscow?
No.
Okay, so well, if you go, if you see where that bridge is, it's right next to St. Basil's Cathedral, 200 meters from the Kremlin wall, the most central location, and you have dozens of security cameras. You have a lot of plainclothes officers everywhere. I mean, it's probably the most well-guarded area, not just in Moscow, but in the whole of Europe. You cannot even stand there for like 2 minutes without plainclothes policemen running to you asking what you're doing, and they killed him there in that spot, in the most central location. So I think, yes, there may well have been a deliberate message in both who he was and also the where it happened, the location.
Yeah, so you mentioned Magnitsky Act. Bill Browder came here several years ago, and he talked about the story, his lawyer, Magnitsky, and how cruel the treatment to him was. I mean, I still remember some of the scenes, stories. So Bill Browder talked about Putin being probably the most powerful man in the world, and he said that he got the wealth well over $200 billion.
It's very likely that Vladimir Putin is the richest man in the world.
Yeah.
Because for almost 2 decades, he and his close friends, colleagues, and associates have been stealing blind from the Russian people. I mean, the nature of the regime we have in power in Russia today, that it's not only authoritarian, but it's also kleptocratic. It's corrupt. These people, they steal from our country. They steal from our people. I mean, you have this kind of group of Putin's old KGB colleagues, his associates from the St. Petersburg City Hall, his friends from the Dacha Ozero cooperative near St. Petersburg, who have, in the years that he's been in power, came from nothing to become dollar-term billionaires. And so I think it's very likely that Putin is the richest man in the world. Of course, this wealth is hidden. It's not official, and the way it's stashed is usually done through people who are close to him. Not in his own name, he's too clever for that, but in other people's names. And so, you know, a couple of years ago, when the Panama Papers came out, there was, of course, a story about one of Putin's old friends, a cellist, Sergei Roldugin, who, you know, was found to have $2 billion worth of assets in this only one offshore jurisdiction, in only one offshore in Panama. So you can, this is just a small tip of the iceberg. But even things like this show that, you know, there's enormous wealth concentrated in the hands of Putin and his cronies and his friends and his associates. So I think it's very likely that Putin is the richest person in the world. So who's most powerful? I mean, I don't know. The world is the world is a fast-changing place. I think there are several kind of positions of power, if we're talking about political and economic power on the globe. China is absolutely no doubt one of them. I think traditionally we have always seen kind of the visual embodiment of this global power and influence expressed in the G8, the group of eight, the group of kind of most important, most powerful countries in the world. But of course, because of Mr. Putin's actions, Russia was expelled from the G8 in 2014, 4 years ago. So, you know, there is this myth, this big lie, as part of the Putin propaganda message that back in the 90s when we had democracy, that Russia was humiliated and Russia was on its knees and all the rest of it. And then when Putin came, he kind of, you know, restored our great status and our great power. Well, actually, if we look at the facts, as opposed to the myths that they're coming out with, in the 90s, Russia was invited to join the G8, the group of eight, the club, the group of most important industrialized nations in the world. Because of Mr. Putin, we were expelled from there. I think, you know, from where I am, from where I stand, it's more in line with Russian national interests to be in the G8 than to be expelled from the G8. But that's just one small illustration.
Yeah. One of the things I can think of is people would associate Putin's power exercise in the line of KGB mindset or sort of techniques. Western media focus a lot on Putin's individual style and using all these KGB interpretation of what he did. So do you think that also illustrate not the latent power, but how they exercise the power, the influence?
Well, of course, also the systems are very different. I mean, Russia in the same period have had three very distinct eras. So we also had a communist one-party dictatorial state until the late 80s, early 90s. Then we had a brief decade of democratic development, of multi-party free democracy. Now, of course, we have this corrupt, kleptocratic authoritarian state built by Vladimir Putin. So the backgrounds are different and kind of the context is different. And also, don't forget that what's also different is that, you know, Russia for decades now has been integrated into many European institutions and more generally Western institutions like the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has very clear internationally recognized standards in things like elections, freedom of the media, freedom of assembly. And Vladimir Putin has been violating all of those standards. So he's not only been violating Russian laws and the Russian constitution, but he's also been violating very clear international obligations that the Russian Federation has undertaken. I think that may be another reason, and understandably so, why Western media and the Western world is so focused on the way that Putin has been destroying democracy in Russia, because he's done this in direct violation and direct contradiction of our international obligations.
For any individuals, there is a contrast mechanism going on. For example, in China, we would contrast what we're experiencing today with what happened 100 years ago, the so-called 100-year humiliation, this sort of narrative, but also historically true. But in Russia, you have this different periods, and you have this democratic experiment, but failed in the early 90s.
No, I would say it didn't fail. It was destroyed. It was destroyed.
Yeah, destroyed. So it's interesting because I also asked some of the Russian living in Chicago, son of an Uber driver. I try to ask them, what do you think of Putin? They don't have very strong opposition to what Putin did, and they also distinguish what happens in politics and what happens to personal experience. And they sort of want to go back to Russia. They think Americans are not very reflective. I mean, culturally speaking, they feel more attachment to the Russian culture. So one thing I found interesting is Putin's power base is not economic, because at a certain point, Russia's economy was so creaky. Right now it's going a little bit better. But basic idea I can get is Putin's power base is cultural and ideological. And he is a great storyteller. I mean, he has the narrative of, how Western reformers failed to prescribe for Russia. Now, Russians' average life expectancy is 71-year-old. The economy is improving, and Russia seems to be a resurgent power in a position to challenge Western democracy. So all this sorts of narrative is created by him. They feel that Putin is lesser of the evil for them, I mean, from my conversation with them. So how would you convince ordinary Russians that Putin's style is something that they should oppose?
First of all, the honest answer is we do not know what Russians think about Vladimir Putin, because there are only two ways to tell what the state of public opinion is and what the people think about their government. One is through elections, and the other is through opinion polls. Neither have any meaning or relevance in Russia today, because elections have long become a meaningless ritual that are controlled, that are rigged, that are manipulated, where in most cases, genuine opposition candidates are not even allowed on the ballot. So, elections have long stopped to be a real barometer of public opinion. As for the opinion polls, I don't think opinion polls have any meaning in an authoritarian system. When, first of all, a large part of the population do not have access to objective information, because, the first thing Mr. Putin ensured when he came to power is that he controls all national television networks. So all the major sources of information for people are directly controlled by the government. But more importantly, what's the point of talking about opinion polls when people inevitably measure their responses against potential consequences? And if you look at actually a recent poll done by the Levada Center, the most respectable polling agency in Russia, 30% of people said in the poll that they are afraid to honestly say their opinion. And that's only the people who are not afraid to say that they're afraid. We don't know about all the others. And, just think about it as, you sit at your home somewhere, in your kitchen somewhere in Russia. You know everything that's happening in the country. You know that opponents of Putin are denounced as traitors and enemies and foreign agents. You know that they can be put to prison. You know that they can be harassed and attacked and killed. And you know the peaceful opposition demonstrations are being beaten up and dispersed. You know all this, and then somebody calls you on the phone or gives you a knock on the door and says, hello, I'm from a polling agency. What do you think of Vladimir Putin? What are you going to say? This is absolutely meaningless. I think a much better way of so when you were talking about how successful Putin's narrative is, well, let's not forget that he has a monopoly on a narrative. Because the first thing he did when he came to power, literally the first raid by government law enforcement agencies against Media Most, which was at that time the largest independent media holding in Russia. The first raid was conducted 4 days after Putin's inauguration as president in May of 2000. And within the first 3 years of his rule, he has destroyed, so either taken over or shut down, every nationwide independent television network in the country. So he has a complete monopoly on the major sources of information. So it's easy to push your narrative when you control all sources of information. So I think a much better way of judging how successful or how popular is Vladimir Putin than the bogus opinion poll figures of 86, 90, 95% that they produce in his support, or the bogus election figures which they themselves control. I think a much better way is actually to look at the behavior of the regime itself. I always have one very simple question. If Vladimir Putin is really so popular, why is he so afraid of a free election? Why is he so afraid of letting his opponents on the ballot? Why is he so afraid of independent media that he has to shut it down? Why is he so afraid of opposition demonstrations that he has to beat them up and disperse them and arrest people for nothing, for just coming out to protest? To me, that's not that doesn't speak to the behavior of somebody who's popular and confident. To me, that speaks to the behavior of somebody who is insecure and uncertain about his own standing. And I think, frankly, if you look at what's been happening in Russia over the past year, with tens of thousands of people who have been going out to the streets all across country, in large cities and small towns, from west to east, to protest against the Putin regime and its corruption, and its lack of accountability and transparency, and its lack of democratic elections, and everything else that it has brought to Russia. When you look at those tens of thousands of people who have been demonstrating, and you know, as you know well, because you know you're from China, I have to explain this to Americans that you know here in the U.S. they have their First Amendment rights. If they go out to demonstrate against the government, they're protected by police. In Russia, you're beaten up and arrested by police if you go to demonstrate against the government. You can be sacked from your job. You can be expelled from university. You can be attacked and harassed. And yet tens of thousands of people have been going out to protest, and most of them are young people. This is really important. The vast majority of those who've been protesting on the streets of Russia in the past year and are continuing to do so are young people, university students, high school students, you know, those in their late teens and early 20s. The people who literally, this is not a figure of speech, who literally represent the future of Russia, the tomorrow of Russia. And I think looking at them, we should really be asking that question of how popular Vladimir Putin really is. That so many young people who have never seen anything else, because, you know, if you're 19 or 20 years old, you don't know anything except Vladimir Putin, because he's been in power since 1999. And yet increasingly that generation, those young people are going out and saying enough, we've had enough of this. And I think this could potentially be a turning point for political developments in Russia. And I think this is certainly a very worrying trend, a very worrying sign for the Putin regime. But I think it's a very hopeful and very promising sign for the future of Russia.
So in political science, people talk about the limitation of democracy. For example, lots of things are not about democracy. It's about bureaucracy. It's about experts. It's about state capacity. It's about rule of law. I mean, democratic government is characterized free and fair election. It's about civil liberty because of free press. So there's a limitation of democracy. So what is Russian people's understanding of democracy? Because I've done a research before. I try to compare U.S. citizens' idea of democracy and Indian people's idea of democracy. And Indians have the tendency to associate democracy with some good stuff, like toilet, like electricity. I mean, China, people also associate democracy with all the good stuff. I mean, there's a 20 Chinese character socialist core value, and the first two are democracy and wealth. I mean, they associate this good stuff with democracy.
Sure.
So how do Russian people associate democracy?
Well, frankly, I think it was Winston Churchill who said that democracy is a very bad system of government unless you count everything else. And I think the centuries of human development have proven beyond any doubt that a democratic system is the only system that allows citizens of a country to prosper, to achieve their full potential, to enjoy the rights and freedoms that they're entitled to. And you know, when you say that democracy is limited, well, I would say it's actually the foundation of everything. You cannot have rule of law without democracy. You cannot have transparency without democracy. I mean, increasingly people in Russia, if you want to talk about Russia specifically, increasingly people are realizing that, you know, the big protests that have been going on the past year, the immediate trigger was corruption. So about a year ago, a bit more now, in March of 2017, there was a big investigation produced by Alexei Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation into the secret financial assets, secret financial empire of Dmitry Medvedev, the Russian Prime Minister. They're showing all his yachts, mansions, villas, vineyards in Italy and all the rest of it. And that was the immediate trigger for the corruption. That's when people began to go out to the streets to protest. But increasingly the protest became not just about the corruption itself, but about the political conditions and the political system that allows for such enormous corruption. Because the reason it is possible for people who occupy positions of government to steal blind from their own citizens, from their own people, is because there's no parliament to keep them to check and to account, because parliament is a rubber stamp, because they know they cannot lose power in elections, because we don't have free and fair elections in Russia, because there's no independent media that can talk about all of this and hold them to account and prevent them from doing this. So increasingly, people are realizing that the root cause of the corruption and the nepotism and all these abuses is the fact that we have no free elections, no real pluralistic parliament, no vibrant independent media on a national level. And increasingly people see the link between the lack of democracy, the absence of democracy that happened under Vladimir Putin, and all the problems and the abuses and the corruption that have been characteristic of the system. So I think increasingly for people in Russia, especially for that young generation, for the people who have been going out to protest, democracy means actually what it means, I suppose, for most people in the developed world, which is the best guarantee to have a government that respects its own citizens and that is accountable to its own citizens. I think that's what it's seen as being about.
So what do you think of what is happening in the world today? People say more countries are retreating from this democratic ideal and there's a recession of democracy after 1990s, the third wave of democracy. Yeah. And today people talk about the resurgence of authoritarianism. We'll talk about the issue with Western society, because in times of anxiety, especially economic anxiety, there is an advantage for authoritarianism to seep in. For one thing, in times of anxiety and distrust, I mean mainly distrust of government, clear centralized authority is easier to be accepted by people than dispersed amorphous authority, because people are anxious about their personal conditions. People tend to rally around a specific person than an abstraction, rallying around a specific person who promises something for them, like Donald Trump, or in Russia, Vladimir Putin. And the third argument is democracy is built on faith, and that faith is on individual citizens. And in today's world, not many people believe in the power of individual citizens, because how easy public opinion can be manipulated, not only by authoritarian regime, but also by media, because media have the tendency to chase for ratings, and people are not that reliable in the sense of the progressive ideal by John Dewey, like it's an experiment. People are reasonable enough to experiment to the point that we can find a best form of democracy through trials and error. So what do you think of this war of ideas? What advantages does Putin really have, and how should Western countries defend themselves of this structural opportunity for authoritarian regimes? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I just completely disagree with characterizations of democracy as amorphous or abstract. I think centuries of human development have proven that democracy is the only real guarantee of a normal, decent, prosperous life for people to reach their potential, to enjoy their rights and freedoms. I mean, people have tried strong leaders. Adolf Hitler was one. How well did that end? And I just think it's completely, inaccurate to... And that's what the authoritarians do, of course, right? You're right, exactly. That's how they portray that this is some amorphous abstract. Let's rally around a strong leader. We know how strong leaders usually end. It's never well. Not a single one. And so we have centuries of human development as absolutely, unarguable proof that democracy is the best basis and the best system of government that can exist anywhere in the world. And you're right in that I think it's fair to say that now, in recent years, there has been this kind of resurgence of some authoritarian tendencies, even in democratic countries. I mean, look, for example, at Hungary and Poland, two countries in the European Union that have been, Orban and Kaczynski, who have been criticized for moving in an authoritarian direction in what should be a, country beyond question, a European Union member country. So I think you're right to say that there is this kind of, the recent trends have been less hopeful than the ones, for example, in the 1990s. But, I'm a historian myself by education, and history always moves like this. It always moves in spirals. And so we know for certain that there will be another spiral, another movement in another direction, and there will be a new wave of democratization coming, and it will affect Russia. But on your very important second part of your question about how the West can defend itself from kind of Putinist tendencies, I think, frankly, the best way to defend itself for the West is to put a stop to the export of corruption from the Putin regime to the West. Because, for somebody to export corruption somebody else needs to import it. It goes both ways.
Yeah.
And what has been happening for years is that, we've had this absolutely phenomenal hypocrisy right at the heart of the Putin system of power, where you had the same people who abuse and attack and undermine the most basic norms of democracy and rule of law in Russia, then go to Western countries and enjoy the benefits and the privileges and the protections of democracy and rule of law in the West, because it's in the West where they open bank accounts, buy real estate, send their wives and their mistresses, send their children to schools and all the rest of it. So it's amazingly phenomenal hypocrisy on their part, but also on the part of Western countries, in my view. This constitutes enabling. Because if the West welcomes those who are complicit in corruption and human rights abuses in Russia, or anywhere else, that means they're enabling corruption and human rights abuses in Russia or anywhere else. And so, what I mentioned earlier, that I've been involved in 8 years now almost in this international Magnitsky campaign, and a campaign to bring those personal targeted sanctions from Western countries on crooks, corrupt officials and human rights abusers in Russia and anywhere else. I think that's just an absolutely indispensable instrument. And it's a brilliant instrument as well, because it introduces personal accountability. Before, what people would do was just slap sanctions on the entire countries. And to me, it makes absolutely no sense, to punish an entire country for the actions of a small, unelected clique sitting in the Kremlin, or, if we're talking about other countries, the other dictatorships. You should go after them. And the brilliance of the Magnitsky legislation is that it introduces this personal accountability, this personal responsibility. And so it's very heartening and very hopeful to see, as of today, 5 countries, the US, Canada, and the 3 Baltic states, introducing this legislation and passing this legislation and enacting this legislation. I flew in from London yesterday. I was there 2 days ago to testify at the British Parliament on the very same issue of the Magnitsky legislation in the UK. I'm going to be in Copenhagen in a few weeks in Denmark to testify at their parliament on this very same issue. And we hope that more of Western democracies, more of the world's democracies, frankly take a stand of principle, a position of principle on this issue, and send a message that the crooks and the corrupt officials and the human rights abusers will no longer be welcome in their countries or in their banks.
After 2012 Magnitsky Act, Obama administration was also very timid, or not.
First of all, they didn't want it to happen. We didn't want it to happen. They tried to stop it, but then when there was such strong bipartisan leadership in Congress, it became law. And then you use precisely the right word, timid. It was really timid about implementing it. They would only put really small level people on it.
What was the rationale behind this timidness?
Well, they didn't want it in the first place. They had a reset with Putin, if you recall. Obama had a reset policy to Putin. They wanted to be friends.
And also for Trump,
every U.S. president. I remember George Bush, who looked into Putin's eyes and got a sense of his soul, or whatever he said. Obama had a reset. Obama praised Putin for the great work he's doing on behalf of the Russian people. Of course, now we hear everything about this current U.S. president. He also wants to be friends. I mean, I think this is just a remarkable bipartisan continuity going back, almost 2 decades.
It's interesting because in recent years, America don't seem to be interested in human rights promotion. And if you ask any diplomat, they will give you a list of priority. The first one definitely is about national security, directly related to the United States. And human rights issue is probably at the bottom 10,
20 or something.
So in face of this reality, what kind of strategy you should adopt?
Well, frankly, I think there's nothing new in this. And even going back, if we're talking about Russia, going back to Soviet times, there were leaders in the West back in the 60s and 70s who wanted nothing to do with human rights. It was just turning a blind eye, closing their eyes, and trying to be friendly with, Brezhnev, or whoever was in the Kremlin at the time. So this is nothing new. This has been a consistent... There has been a consistent, they call it pragmatic, I think it would be more appropriate to call it cynical approach from some political leaders in the West. Then, forget these things like democracy and human rights, let's just be friends, let's just find some sort of accommodation with these regimes, in international affairs, for example. And apart from being, in my view, immoral, this approach is also very short-sighted and very, frankly, foolish, because certainly when it comes to Russia, if you look at the trends in Russian history in the past century or so, every time a regime would engage in domestic repression, he would also engage in external aggression. They're two sides of the same coin. It's impossible, to have a regime that breaks its own laws and disrespects its own people to then behave like a responsible citizen on the international stage and respect the interests of other countries. Why should it? Mm-hmm. External aggression is always the other side of the coin to domestic repression. One always follows another. And so I think this was shown very clearly in the Western leaders' approaches to Vladimir Putin. So when Putin came to power, it was immediately clear what direction he was going to go. Mm-hmm. He began to shut down independent television channels, he began to rig elections, he began to put his opponents in prison. Everything was clear. Mm-hmm. And yet for years and years and years, Western leaders, including Bush and Obama and European leaders and others, would basically turn a blind eye to all of that, close their eyes on that, in an attempt to continue building up some sort of relationship with Putin. And we know how it ended. Those people who would turn a blind eye on political repression, media censorship, and election fraud in Russia would one day, they woke up to the first territorial annexation in Europe since the Second World War, which is what Putin did in Crimea in 2014. So again, it's not only immoral to ignore human rights and democracy, it's also short-sighted.
So I think people in Western countries seem to have some distorted view of Putin's invasion in Crimea. They think it's about geopolitics. They think it's about Putin trying to exercise influence westward. Mm-hmm. But it seems to me it's more like a domestic...
It's totally domestic.
Domestic, like trying to, prevent this example. Like there's a corrupt leader, adjacent to Russia, and now...
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. Putin was really afraid of the Ukrainian revolution. Mm-hmm. Because, first of all, Ukraine and Russia are so similar. Mm-hmm. We share centuries of common culture, history, language, religion, everything. Yeah. We are very similar countries. And so when he saw a successful democratic revolution in Ukraine that toppled a corrupt authoritarian leader, that was a very dangerous precedent for him. Because he thought, today Ukraine, tomorrow Russia. Mm-hmm. So he set out to prevent the success of the Ukrainian democratic revolution, to stop it from serving as an example for Russian citizens in a few years' time. So that's why the annexation of Crimea, that's why the war in eastern Ukraine, that's why all the measures and all the actions, that's all of viral propaganda against the Ukrainians. You're absolutely right, it's domestic. It's 99% driven by domestic considerations. I mean, for him, the geopolitical kind of spread is an added benefit. So for him it's fine to kind of increase territory, but the main consideration is domestic.
That's why one of the professors in IR in U Chicago, John Mearsheimer, argues that it's wrong for the diplomat to think in geopolitical terms.
Right.
He thinks that Russia is more on the self-defense side, and
not Russia, but the Putin regime.
Putin regime is in a way to bolster its own regime. It's not like West expansionism. So
absolutely.
Yeah, this kind of misunderstanding creates more problem, not on specific human rights abuser or Putin, but on the relationship between the two countries. What do you think of this misunderstanding created by this media depiction?
I think actually a lot of the world media, and this is actually a big point of contention for us. Every time I do like interviews with BBC or CNN or whatever, I always, and they ask me something like, so why do you think Russia's doing this? Or why do you think Russia's like, stop them. I said, why do you say Russia? Please stop saying Russia when you mean Putin.
Yeah.
They're not one and the same thing. And like you referred to that guy who says, we should stop talking in geopolitical terms. I mean, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who's the founder of Open Russia, one of the main opposition figures in Russia, he says, well, the Putin regime is basically a criminal gang. Stop thinking about this in kind of, same as that professor saying, stop thinking about this in like diplomatic and international terms. Truly, it's not like a national security issue, it's more of a police issue. Treat them like a criminal gang that they are. They're the people who steal from their own citizens, they're the people who violate their own laws and international norms. And why do people equate them with Russia is beyond our understanding. They're not an elected government. Yeah. Putin has never won a free democratic election in his life. And so, what right do they have to speak on the behalf of the country? And so we always emphasize in our meetings and contacts and conversations with members of parliaments, members of governments, with media, because media is important in shaping their messaging. Please don't equate Russia and the Kremlin regime. They're two different things. Please don't equate Russia and Putin. And so I think a lot of the misunderstandings that you ask about come from that major fundamental misunderstanding of people trying to basically equate Russia and a small gang of criminals who are sitting in the Kremlin today. A lot of it comes from there. And we always say, even on the language level, even on the rhetorical level, don't equate, don't confuse the two. Don't confuse a country and a small unelected clique of people who are misruling and stealing from that country. They're different things.
Yeah, I think this mischaracterization also fuels nationalism in Russia, and part of the reason why democracy is facing this setback is many Western countries underestimate the power of nationalism because it's very promiscuous. If you go back and see the history, nationalism can merge with any ideology, with the imperialism of Japan, with anti-colonialism
and don't
countries.
Forget also that
and
even if Putin
Nazism.
uses nationalism as kind of, a veneer, a facade for his regime, it's only an illusion. I mean, their only real ideology is to steal as much money as possible for themselves and for their close friends and colleagues. But obviously they cannot say that because it doesn't sound good. So they need to hide it behind some sort of a quote-unquote ideological picture. And so they use the kind of this great power status or nationalism. These people have no ideology. Their ideology is to steal and to enrich themselves at the expense of the people and the citizens of the country. That's what they do.
Yeah, but for ordinary people, their nationalism is fueled by newspaper. They read the video they see on social media. And also it's true in China. I mean, lots of people are actually politically or ideologically uncommitted. But once they see how those thought leaders or opinion leaders interpret international news, in the us versus them framework, they would tend to have bad opinion about United States. For example, recently I posted a video of Obama's writer who actually authored 4 jokes for Obama's White House Correspondents' Dinner. And on the comment column, people say, oh, it's not written by him. Oh, it's all performed by Obama. And some even praise Trump for being more spontaneous than Obama. So all these things make me think that people have this tendency to think in a more nationalistic way. And the Western countries are less nationalistic. People associate nationalism with some sort of mental...
here, of course. I mean, just look at France last year's presidential election. Marine Le Pen got something like 35%. That's a lot. For a far-right extreme nationalist kind, 35%. That's like tens of millions of people. So even in the West, it can be a problem.
Yeah, I think nationalism is still one of the most powerful ideology in the 20th century, probably into the 21st century. And the Western media are treating nationalism as something, as a mental disease, and wave it away. And in the United States, interesting on the issue of the national anthem, because of
the players,
players. The liberals are so defensive and so even allergic to the idea of patriotism. They don't talk about it. They think it's a kind of disease. And this gives the right or the xenophobic people a monopoly of this discourse on nationalism. And they can use it to rally people around saying, the liberals are unpatriotic and stuff like that. Since like there is the solidarity or, nationalism in the sense of community is abandoned in lots of Western liberals, and they give up this opportunity and make the other side to interpret in a more nationalistic way. I think in Russia it might also be true. Definitely in China, liberals are on the defensive today. Sure. Basically, for me, I think nationalism is going up and is still very powerful. And Western media's underestimation of this nationalism would create some problems. I mean, this is like they live in a different universe.
To understand because they're experiencing a lot of these things in Western politics too now. So I think they're beginning to understand that it's actually kind of important and they should be paying attention to it.
Yeah. They should think more about, we cannot just wave it away. It's something that we should focus on, in order to create a platform to converse with each other rather than you are nationalistic, you have some sort of mental disease.
Right.
Yeah. So my final question, so what is your next step?
In what way?
As a dissident in Russia, and right now you are in the United States, do you have a plan to go back to Russia? And,
yes, of course I'm going to come. I mean, I'm here now because I was recuperating after the poisoning last year. But I'm also, as you know, I'm heavily involved in a lot of international work and international outreach on behalf of the Russian opposition. So, actually, the main focus of my work over the last several years have been to engage in this international campaign for the introduction of personal, targeted, individual sanctions from Western countries on corrupt officials and human rights abuses in the Putin regime. So I'm continuing that work. I just returned from London yesterday. I mentioned I was at the British Parliament to speak about this. I'll be in a Danish Parliament soon, and I'm continuing contacts with other parliamentarians in other countries. But in terms of our work inside Russia, I'm the Vice Chairman of Open Russia, which is a national pro-democracy movement. And the main focus of our work inside of Russia, which I'm also involved in, is education, political and civic education, focused on the young people, on the young generation. So through our many training and educational projects, we aim to empower and to help the young generation of civil society and democratic activists in Russia, to help them gain the skills and the experience they will need when that generation faces the task of building a new Russia and of undergoing a transition in a new Russia after Vladimir Putin. So this is the main focus of our work. One of the ways we do that is by creating working groups with the help of prominent experts in their respective fields to work on some of the substance of the future reform proposals that will need to be carried out after Putin, in economy, in constitutional structure, in energy, in all kinds of areas. But secondly, we work with running these training and educational programs for young people, including by, for example, helping them run in local elections, municipal elections across the country, even though we know they're not free, they're not fair, they're not democratic, but we still use the infrastructure of the electoral process as, if you want, as a training ground for people to learn those skills and the experience, how to campaign, how to walk door to door, how to speak at rallies, how to publish leaflets in newspapers, and so on and so on, how to organize on local issues and with local activists. And so last year, for example, in Moscow, in September before the municipal elections, we ran a school of municipal candidates in Moscow, through which about 400 people went through. 67 of them were actually elected municipal councils. We didn't expect to have such a high success. I mean, our goal was to educate them, not necessarily to make them win, but they got educated and they won. And so this year, we are going to open 20 such schools around Russia, schools of municipal candidates to help them kind of learn the skills of democratic campaigning. So that's going to be the main focus of our work for the foreseeable future, because one thing we know about Russian history is that it can throw a few surprises, and that big political changes in Russia can very often start like this, quickly, suddenly, and unexpectedly. 1905 revolution, 1917 revolution, 1991, the democratic revolution that toppled the communist state, the communist regime. They all began suddenly and unexpectedly. Nobody predicted this. And so the fact is that, Putin's regime is not forever. We do not know exactly when or exactly how it's going to exit the stage, but we do know that it will. And we cannot afford not to make the mistake that our predecessors made, for example in 1917 or in 1991, of not being ready for that change. Because the reason so many mistakes were made is because people who came to power were not prepared for it. They were not prepared for the transition. They were not prepared for the change. And we can talk about all the mistakes that were made because of it. We cannot afford to do that again. The next time Russia embarks on a democratic transition, we need to be ready. And when it starts, it'll be too late to sit down and start figuring out what to do next. We need to be doing that now, and this is what we'll continue to do.
Yeah. Hopefully it will be in the hands of people who have governance experience, are strategic in the timing and all the transition.
So that's what we're helping to do. We're helping them to build that experience.
Yeah.
So they don't come completely unprepared.
Great.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thank you for your time.
See you again.